Vrije, very much for inviting me for the introduction. If you want to have your cameras off, fine. If you don't want to be recorded, but if you want to be if you don't have a problem being recorded, I would appreciate it if you could actually turn your cameras on, because for me it's like talking to an empty screen pretty much. I have lots of small windows, nobody's face, so I don't even know how you look like, and I have missed that terribly because I'm teaching online for a year now, and that's definitely not my style. This is something that it's really painful for me, because I like lecture theaters and classrooms. So please do turn on your camera. I have lots of issues. As you have noticed, I speak very fast, and I also have very funny accent. So if I overdo it, don't hesitate to tell me off and tell me to repeat myself. I like repeating myself, to be honest, but beyond liking repeating myself, it's often, I may say, things that are not understandable. My understanding is that nobody in this room is an anthropologist by training. Do I understand that correctly, or I just made that up? Yes, pretty much. So if I say something completely irrelevant, it's not Greek, it's something anthropological, which could be Greek, but that's with science the problem. So still, please do interrupt me and let me know that if I have to clarify something. As you see, I hate PowerPoint. I think that PowerPoint makes everybody stupid. The audience included, the lecturer, everybody. So I'm not gonna do a PowerPoint. So again, this means that you may want me to spell a funny term. Just interrupt me, wave at me. If you have your camera off, you cannot wave at me, so use a chat, and I will happily interrupt in order to clarify things. Now, let me tell you about some funny things from my life. Most of you are architects, correct? How many are architects? How many are civil engineer?
There might be activists here and commons, people who are interested in the commons or designers.
How many people like the commons and are activists? Self-identify as such. Okay. How many people are, hi Andre, how many people are designers by training? Okay, good. Thank you. So I have a better idea about the audience. So I'm a funny anthropologist because my professor was an archaeologist and architect by training, and he was working on architecture. So I did initially anthropology of space. So one of my two supervisors was an architect, the other one was an archaeologist. And when I was young and had hair, and I was in London. So I'm very familiar with architecture, and I am very interested in space. So I started my career studying houses, architecture, socialist architecture in Albania. Many years ago, I decided that Albanian urban planning and architecture is very interesting and very important. And I tried to make an archaeology of contemporary post-socialism by studying the architecture and domestic design and domestic material culture of Albania. Very soon, I realized that nobody wanted to talk to me about the houses. I had the theory that if you want to understand housing as infrastructure, the best place to study that is in post-socialist countries, because for socialism, one of the most revolutionizing things in existing socialist regimes in comparison to socialist theory was that the house was incorporated into infrastructure. Or actually, it's a bit more complicated. Fundamentally, the Marxist definition of infrastructure was including housing. The way that it was translated in the West and the capitalist world, housing couldn't be a part of infrastructure. So it was a very interesting concept. Of course, socialism in much of Eastern Europe was a modernizing force. And as such, was there in order to modernize the society, let's say pre-modern society to a great extent, like most of the Balkans, most of the rural Balkans, which had to be modernized very quickly. What is very important to understand about socialism in Europe and in other places in post-colonial world is that socialism was a very attractive theory of modernization to people and to populations and to societies that were basically striving for progress, were striving for development, were striving for growth. Right, the biggest question, some of the biggest complaints that people had before Second World War in the Balkans is who is going to build the road, who is going to bring electricity, who is going to do the job. And socialism did that. Basically, that's why it was so attractive and had so popular support. The same happened in other Balkan countries which didn't end up socialist, like Greece or in Turkey as well. So the last villas that got electrified in Albania was renamed Drita, so light, right? Because they brought the light. Because quite often the term light, Drita, was synonymous, was considered the same as electricity. So that was my imagination, that I will go and talk to people about housing as infrastructure. Nobody wanted to talk to me about the houses. As infrastructure, they wanted to talk about proper infrastructure. They wanted to talk to me about the roads. So they want to talk to me mostly about the cross-border motorways. Why they want to talk about cross-border motorways? Because 50% of Albanian population after socialism's collapse, they became migrants. The great majority of them became migrants in Greece. So they were using the main cross-border motorway almost on daily basis. Now, as I spend my time being ethnographically, going deeper and deeper and collecting thicker and thicker data, I realized that the entire city that I was studying was basically becoming road-centric. So it was centralizing the cross-border motorway. The avenue that was connecting the city with the motorway was the new urban center. There was an old center, which was the center of the town for 600 years, until 1991. And from 1991 on, a totally new urban center was appearing, mushrooming, which was basically on the avenue that was connecting the city with the cross-border motorway. That could go way more. This could become more complicated the more time one would spend. So what was happening through this road? One of the major things that was flowing back to Albania was money. Albanian people did not trust the banks because in 1997, lots of banks came out of the blue. People invested their money, the banks collapsed, so people did not trust the banking system. So you would carry packs of money back and forward through the borders to give to your relatives as a remittance, right? The same would be applied to building material. So people would gradually and slowly build their houses in Albania, but in order to do that, they would import personally the material from Greece, where most of them were working as builders. So they had good connections with suppliers, and the trip could be literally every month, every 2 months. So slowly, people would bring their entire house, right? First, the building materials, then after the building materials, the furniture, etc. So slowly, the houses were flowing in Albania, and then new development, new constructions would have happened around the motorway. What's very interesting is that Albanian socialism was a very loyal to the theory, to the socialist modernist, to socialist economics. So, for example, you can find lots of stories about university professors who had to spend their August holidays building roads, right? So if you were a teacher, you were a professor, all these jobs were useless. They were non-productive jobs according to the system, and you had to learn how to do a productive job. A productive job is all type of manual jobs. So you would have to go usually to build roads or build houses even. So every single Albanian person in 1991 had work experience on building stuff, on construction, on being a construction worker. And that's why that was the major employment sector where they worked when they migrated to Greece mostly and Italy. What is really peculiar in that story is that, of course, that was voluntary, and it was named, it was for the common good, for the common goal, for the collective idea of collective development, modernization of the country, to build roads. Now, there is another important thing that I want to talk to you about roads. Albania was very peculiar for another reason. Do you know which is the first European country with a national motorway system? Anybody? Any guess? Come on, it's easy. Yes. France? No way. After Second World War.
Germany, I would think.
No.
Okay.
They were pretty late as well. 37 was very late. Any other countries? Britain after Second World War, mate, I'm afraid. Poland, there was a very good road which was connecting Frankfurt with the Polish borders. Guess who used it and when? 1940, someone used that road to open a border barrier. Italy is close. Very close. Okay, the people who invented motorway are the fascists in Italy. The first motorway as we know it is the motorway that connects Milano, with the lakes of the north, like the Lake of Como, etc., etc., etc. It is a private commercial project only. It is made for sports. Basically, driving a fast car was a sport. We know that about Italians. Until today, they drive like this. But it is the whole idea is that basically, I can explain it culturally if you want. But the whole idea is that basically we build the road for sports, to race our cars. But Italian fascist regime in 1920s makes two national motorway system projects. The first one, none of you guessed it, was Albania. By 1928, Albania has a national motorway system built for an organization for the economic development of Albania, Organizzazione per lo Sviluppo Economico di Albania in Italian, founded by Mussolini himself. Can you guess which was the other country which is not European with national motorway system the same period? It's very easy if you think what Italy did in Second World War. Libya, right? So Italians built a national motorway system in Albania and Libya with emphasis on the ports of the Mediterranean, and they used these motorway systems in order to occupy these two countries within a few days at the beginning of Second World War. So it was a war machine, right? It was a war project to build motorways. In order to build this motorway, again, the fascists mobilized voluntary labor by the villagers, by Albanian people, in the case of Albania, Libyan people in the case of Libya, in order to build these motorways for the common good of let's modernize our country. During Second World War, this system in Albania is completely dilapidated, destroyed to the bottom, mostly by the partisans. As soon as the partisans take over the power as a party governing by now, they had a very hard competition, because they had a previous regime that had built fantastic national motorway system, paved with cement, not asphalt. That's another story I can discuss if you want the questions, why we pave our motorways with asphalt. But the motorway system, this fascist logic infrastructure, was basically created mostly in Albania in the name of the collective good, but that collective good was proved to be untrue. So when the socialists comes, then again, the name of the collective good, they create motorways. There was a basic problem with motorways. Albanian people were building voluntary motorways for the common good. Literally, that's a term, right? In Albania, common good. But the first private cars are allowed in the country in 1991. So for 70 years, Albanians were building motorways for the common goods that they couldn't use for their own personal interests. So actually, all of a sudden, 1991, everybody bought a car, a fast car, usually a Mercedes, an old Mercedes from Germany, and they start running like crazy on the roads. The problem is that because these roads were a modernization project, like most infrastructure projects are mostly political, ideological project and not a project to be used. Believe me, if you want a good example, this happens until today. See a wind turbine, a typical example of an infrastructure with exclusive ideological interests and goals, absolutely no practical interest of any description, but don't let me go there at this moment as yet. I come in that later. But that's exactly the situation with motorways, right? So these motorways fell apart instantly because they were not made. They were made in order to be watched. They were not made in order to be used. Mind you, that was the case with Germany as well. Autobahn, the systems of Autobahn built by the Nazis after 1933, when they took the power. I mean, there are historians, German historians of German Nazi history, who call them roads to be filmed rather than roads to be used. Because again, Germany will have the first nationalization of Yes. Did someone say something?
No, I think they were entering the room and they didn't have
Okay, good. So actually we create this infrastructure. So that was what I was studying, or to put it a bit all together. So that's a use of participatory labor, of social participation to a common infrastructure in name, but organized by central state authorities. Fascist authorities in the first hand, communist state-run authorities in the case of Albania in the period. Now, let me go to post-socialism. In 2008, after spending 6 years studying Albania, 5 years studying Albania, I started studying Greece. At that time, I published a book called Revolt and Crisis in Greece. I edited that book together with many colleagues who contributed very kindly. And we start discussing basically the relation between, this is the beginning of my research on the relation between infrastructures and collective action during crisis. In 2008, December 2008, Greece has a revolt, a major revolt, very similar to in terms of motifs and in terms of semiotics, similar to the August 2011 riots in London. As they call them. I don't like the word riot. Let's say the clashes, right? So it is a very similar phenomenon which happens already in 2008. 2008, Greece was blossoming. The Greek economy was doing the best it was doing. It was at the peak of a 15-year development, to a large extent thanks to the cheap labor coming from Albanian migrants who were building and rebuilding the infrastructures in this small country, modernizing our infrastructures for very little money. But these infrastructures were coming as a collective identification project, a huge collective identification project, right? It was our new nation, it was a new Greece. It was literally called modernizers, the government's Tony Blair style social democrats, third way social democrats, whose nickname was modernizers. So they were modernizing the country using cheap labor of Albanian migrants who were not legalized. They couldn't legalize their existence in the country, for more than a decade, precisely because the cheap labor was necessary in order to modernize the infrastructure of this country, which was falling apart. So we had also Olympic Games, a mega event, like London had Olympic Games before the riots, around the riot period. So all of a sudden, we basically end up in a night of riots. It is very similar story to Dagan. Basically, a police officer kills a 15-year-old kid during a typical altercation in central Athens, and then starts a huge riot, which lasts for an entire month. The police lose the power to control many parts of the cities. It spreads in all major towns and cities of the country. And actually, prefectures, city halls, buildings are occupied, schools are occupied, universities are occupied. It is like literally a rebellion, a proper rebellion that's happening. In the night of the riot, 6th of December 2008, there is semiologically, there's a very interesting mobilization of the populations. The first people who start clashing with the police, throwing a lot of cocktails, have work, let's say, on the revolt, who actually revolt, are the central Athenian neighborhood of Exarchia, a very politicized neighborhood, the place where this kid was shot dead, and then these things start spreading all around the city. The second subjects of the revolt are migrants. Migrants and other, what Fanon would call rest of the earth, who were around another central square of the city, the second most central square of the city, Omonia Square. The third would be middle-class youth. And that's a very awkward situation because this middle-class youth in their 20s, 30s, quite often with university degree, with full-time jobs, who are the so-called 700 euro generation. Why they call 700 euro generation? Because they work full-time, but the salary was at the time 700 euro per month. So that wouldn't be enough to even rent your own house, or wouldn't be enough to have a decent life unless you had a very middle-class background and you could afford to have support from parents. But there is lots of anger because there is a huge party, there is urban development, there's constant reconstruction, enormous waste of money for big infrastructures, which would be really useless in Greece. For example, we've got a fantastic, huge softball stadium for the Olympic Games. Nobody has ever played softball in Greece. You would have baseball federation and baseball fields being built for the in the name of the Olympic Games. Nobody has ever played baseball in Greece, etc., etc. So it was literally a waste of public money, and at the same time, lots of classes, lots of categories of the population groups would become poorer. So these people basically collectively united and fought with the police, occupied the buildings, did the revolt, carried out a revolt. Fast forward from 2008 and 2011, we start the so-called Occupy Syntagma movement. Right, the Syntagma Square, after the Arab Spring in Egypt and other Arab countries, the next European country that takes over is, of course, Spanish. The reason Spanish take over is because they are related with the Arabs with historical long commitments, but also because each one of the countries that it is really badly affected by the crisis. And the second one is Athens. And there is a very interesting situation that happens there. The squares, the symbols of the infrastructures that were built, were brand new, were symbolizing this modern Greece, powerful Greece in the center of the city, are being occupied by protesters, demonstrators, many, many thousands of them, who reverse totally the meaning of the place. They reverse the meaning of the place through daily practice for 3 months. It's a very interesting concept. Let me give you an example of what do I mean. Syntagma Square is in front, Constitution Square this is in front of the House of Parliament. The House of Parliament is where formerly the palace of the king was when Greece had a king. King was kicked out eventually, he had the palace later somewhere else, but it's the symbol of power, of political power in the country. And Syntagma Square, in front of it was the so-called showcase square of modern Greece, of the Olympic Games. Do you want to give you a good example of how that worked? Syntagma Square is constructed in it was there, but it's paved with marble and becomes a square in 1896. In 1896, you probably do not know it, but it's the first modern Olympic Games, which take place in Athens. So we have a mega event. And the name of that mega event, we reconstruct a very important square of the city. Between 1896 and 1989, there's no major change on the square's materiality, right? The square is not changed at all. There is nothing that major that happens, a fountain appears, etc. Some damages are fixed, but there is nothing major. Between 1989 and 2003, the Olympic Games in Athens was 2004, Syntagma Square is reconstructed from scratch 3 times. So for 1 century, nothing happens. And within 10, 15 years, the square is rebuilt 3 times, precisely textbook creative destruction, as David Harvey describes it. Precisely, textbook, literally. Keep reconstructing it, keep remaking it, keep repaving it. And they make it this really shiny square in the the newly founded commercial center of Athens. Is the center from where streets with high streets, 3, 4 high streets with shops, lots of big brands start in the center of the city. It is a square which is not used for people, right? It's not created in order for people to use it, to sit. There's hardly any benches anymore. And basically, it's like a corridor. It's a corridor, it's a metro. The metro, Athens gets a metro, an underground train. And it's the most central metro station which connects the 2 major lines. And this is where people are coming and they use it like a corridor. It's literally a corridor that there is nowhere for you to stay. And all of a sudden, when this entire story collapses in 2011, this very same square, this fantastic commercial center square, becomes the square of resistance, a place where assemblies take place, where riots and classes take place, where people defended with their own bodies and against the police, and where actually there is another rebellion, second rebellion against the crisis this time, which incorporates much more subjects than before, who actually collectively work in order to create a completely different type of infrastructure. From this, this eventually actually was July 2011, 10 years ago. It is the end of the month. It is just 10 years after this square was eventually evacuated after huge clashes that happened there, when actually the government of the country voted for the big austerity measures, for the memorandum of agreement between IMF, EU, and Central European Bank. And actually it's the final battle of Syntagma Square, as we call it, where there are more than 2,000 tear gas canisters, more than 400 people injured in hospitals, literally more than 20,000 police officers were clashing with many dozens of tens of thousands of demonstrators. So basically the center of the city square itself, the infrastructure of the golden period, as we called it, of the modernized Greece, we saw it basically collapsing and being altered completely in the way that it was supposed to move. From this square, the result from this square appears afterwards lots of smaller projects in the neighborhoods. So Central Athens pretty much loses lots of the political power, and lots of projects appear in the neighborhoods of people who take over infrastructures in order to manage them, to self-manage them, organize them, and actually provide facilities which were not there before. For example, we have lots of social clinics. I'm studying now in my current project called infra-demos, infra-demos.net, from Infrastructure and Democracy in Greece, a project that Torange mentioned before. Social clinics, social medical centers, social pharmacies, as we call them. We study social education systems. Now, what do we mean by that? These are solidarity economy, not social economy, solidarity economy projects, where actually groups of activists are providing infrastructures that previously were provided by the state. One of the golden periods of this kind of effort is 2015. Between 2011, Syntagma Square, and 2015, we have an enormous increase of projects. If you will see infra-demos, we recorded all these projects of infrastructures. And if you will see between 2010 and 2018-19. So if you will see the first period between 2010 and 2015, the majority of collective actions around infrastructures do not demand social participation. What they mostly demand is for infrastructures to remain public, owned by the state, not to fire the workers, etc., etc. If you will see up from 2013, 14, 15, 16, the majority of social collective actions, of social participation, of basically contradictions around infrastructures, right? They have to do with social participation, with infrastructure to become transfigurative projects that demand the social participation in their management and their operation, and to operate in totally different ways than used to be operated in the past. We also have published another article about it, if you want me to send it at the end, about this mapping of all these projects around infrastructures. Now, from 2015 on, we have a decrease, but we have a solidification, more solid. By the way, solidarity and solidity come from the same etymological root, and there is a reason for that. But we have the solidification of many of these projects we have a decrease, so we have less such projects, but we have them to be much more solid, much more long-lasting. So we have for 10 years now, since 2011, projects that are running for 10 full years in a completely alternative economic and alternative political economic system. There was a problem in 2015. Syriza won the elections. So a left party, which was linked with lots of these projects, or tried to be linked with lots of these projects, a government which created a ministry, a governmental ministry of social solidarity, etc., 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 came into that game and suffocated many of these type of self-organized infrastructures, because fundamentally they couldn't, because lots of these infrastructures became very much dependent on the government. So they lost lots of their transfigurative power and lots of their independence, and then the government didn't provide what had promised to deliver, and lots of such infrastructure start collapsing. And of course, there was huge schism within the solidarity and social economy, social movements, in the case of that period, because lots of people identified with the states, with the state apparatuses, other people were really anti-state, so eventually it was a conflict which created lots of conflict which couldn't find resolution, couldn't be resolved. And then lots of such projects collapsed altogether. What is very interesting is that these projects came in other countries. If you want to see a good example of how fast this infrastructure worked, you can see the refugee crisis, as we call them, in 2015. It took for the European Union authorities and the state authorities almost 6 months to react since the beginning of the crisis. By crisis, we mean the increase, the big increase in the population of migrants who are crossing the Turkish-Greek borders. This partly happens because of governmental decisions, by the way, right? At the time, Syriza, coming from the left, were like, no, we're not going to guard the borders. That's, we are all brothers and sisters. The borders need to be open, solidarity to migrants. But then, of course, they realized that this means 500,000 people coming in the country within 6 months, in a country which doesn't even have, which has been forced to close half of the hospitals and medical centers the 5 years before, to a country which doesn't even have enough money to maintain schools, or because basically austerity came with that enormous dilapidation of public sector, creating basically infrastructural gap. Now, the concept of infrastructure, so what I want to say is that when the refugee crisis happened, the first 6 months was almost exclusively social and solidarity economy apparatuses that did the rescue and the reception and of the migrants and all this. So what used to be a prime domain of state apparatus operations all of a sudden became an operation which was taken over by solidarity and social economy, and of course an awkward, I would say, entity which involved social solidarity economy, local communities, etc. It's the church, it's local church. It's so a very awkward situation, which included philanthropy, included also solidarity economy or social economy. Now, what is really interesting is that the term of infrastructural gap appears in 2015. I knew we used to know it a lot in development studies. When you talk about the global south, very often you would hear the term infrastructural gap. But since the austerity of 2010, 2011, you see this concept appearing more and more. By 2015, Europe was the worst place for infrastructural companies to invest, the worst continent. So if you were a private infrastructure company, you didn't want to invest in Europe in 2015. It had a very bad economies in the Eurozone, and Euro was very unstable. Britain was falling apart, and there was nothing else to privatize after already 5-6 years of Tories. So basically, it wasn't a good thing to invest in Europe. As you know, the hand of the market is invisible, so nothing was happening. And of course, at the same time, the public sector didn't have money. As I wrote in the article, which some of you may see, if you will see the strategic investment priorities of the European Union from 2015, they emphasize infrastructures. At the same time, they say that we cannot afford anymore. So, you know, we tend to scold private infrastructural sector investment, private investment infrastructure. That's all bollocks. Excuse my language. Basically, lots of the private investment infrastructure, public money. So it's public money, the coalition of public and private sector is public money. Private sector manages, builds, and usually takes for a few years the infrastructure to manage it in the future. So basically dependent entirely on public money, but there is no more public money. Eurozone has basically has fallen apart. Britain has fallen apart as an economy. We don't know where it's going. So basically Europe has no public money for infrastructures. So private sector is out of it. What happens next is that this becomes visible in the high echelons. At the same time, what becomes visible in the high echelons of European elites, political elites, is that actually there is a new model that has emerged in lots of the countries hit badly by the crisis, called social solidarity economy. So they strive for a change which will exploit this societal power. So for example, if you would see what is our plan for the future of energy in Europe, it's pretty clear that the green transition in Europe cannot happen if it depends on public sector and private sector. It can happen only if it depends on social economy. So for example, the new model promoted for the provision of energy in European Union is called energy communities. If energy communities project is very successful, I think, and I'm pretty sure that in the future generations will have to do something similar. We'll have to manage and administrate lots of other infrastructures through social participation. If you will read the legal texts, which by January 2021 were adopted by all European countries, obliged to be adopted by all EU members, it is as, since lots of you are activists, it is most probably as if you wrote it, or some of you wrote it, since you are lots of you into infrastructures, commons, and social participation. It's very progressive, very radical lefty texts about power to the people and about people taking over the power in their hands, not depend on private corporations or their energy. They are not anymore consumers, they are prosumers, which means producers and consumers together, and they take the decision through assemblies how to operate, how to produce the energy they're using. So this is, if you will, there is at least two, in order to start concluding. At the moment, there are at least two powers that are going on, two tendencies that are simultaneous. One comes from above, the other comes from below. They both try to basically drag social resources, societal resources, into the management, into the operation of infrastructures, and even to the production of infrastructures, because energy community incorporate, the energy communities will build the infrastructure, they will adopt existed already renewable energy infrastructures and manage them. Now, how can you transform communities who have been socialized for many generations to receive infrastructural flows and make them into producers of infrastructure? It's something that we don't have a blueprint how to do it. What we have as a blueprint is that by 2050, 37% of European households will be involved into the production of energy within the context of energy communities. So almost 1 in 4 households will be producing their energy as a community. They will participate in the community, making decisions online, through apps, or through natural assemblies. So altogether, and of course, the bottom-up reaction to the infrastructural gap in Europe comes again from that tendency. So what I want to say is that quite often when we hear, I mean, the reason I gave you these 2 examples, the examples of Albania and the examples of Greece and the example of Europe during the infrastructural gap, is that quite often the idea of commons or commons themselves quite often are hollow, right? It's a context, not a content, very often. And it's used, can have very bad use. Because at the moment, the infrastructural community sounds like the wet dream of every commoner that will take over the infrastructures, but it is a plan that comes from above. Similarly, the building of the roads by Albanians for the common good as a common effort where even university professors, politicians, office workers would participate, was for the common good, this empty common good. So common, the idea of common, the idea of public, the idea of collective, etc., they can have very reactionary determinations and definitions. I think there is a big battle that's going on here. And this battle is a practical battle. It is not only a theoretical battle. I don't think it's theoretical at all. I think whatever we have to contribute in theories of commons has been contributed. We already know it. The point that is happening now, what is very interesting, is that we haven't determined the practices of common properly. In other words, at the moment that the ideas of common energy production are promoted by the same European Union that promotes the interests of the banks, promotes the interest of Siemens, other big energy corporations, dirty energy corporations, etc., etc., etc. The period that the national governments, very reactionary right-wing national governments, create ministries, governmental ministries of social solidarity, calling basically the society to participate because we don't have any more the money to pay 200,000 euro per year to a CEO of a private energy company, can very easily go wrong. So I would like to conclude it here in order to have some time for discussion, in order to give you some food for thought just before your holidays in this last lecture of the series, where if we simplify it, there is a question that emerges from my current research, is commons good, or can commons be always something which corresponds to the common good? And how do we react when the enemy, if you want, a political elite of anti-commoners calls the commons to come and save and rescue capitalism from its crisis? Thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate that you came in this hot day of July to listen. And please, if you have any questions, objections, or comments, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was brilliant. So if there are any questions, please put your hand up, or just, yeah, I'll flick through. Yes, Jen.
Hi, I was interested in your quick comment saying you get to it later about the wind turbines as imaginary and how it relates to these 2 examples and things like ownership, collective ownership of turbines in places like Denmark versus other parts of the EU that have tried and failed. I'm really curious to have you complete your thought.
Yes, there's a very interesting. Okay, when we come to wind turbines, at the moment, the way that they are usually run is on an industrial scale. So basically, if you want to have an effective aeolic energy installation, you need to put lots of wind turbines, and then you don't really challenge the logic of the industrial production of energy. Secondly, what you're doing is that you're selling this wind turbine to the same networks that are operated again with similar way that we know in a world of energy poverty. If you don't have money, you're not getting any energy. It's very simple. The second thing that comes in when it comes into wind turbines is that there is the entire idea of extractivism. If we have wind, we shouldn't leave this wind unexploited. So it's a very similar logic. If you want the cultural logic of wind turbines, very similar to that of extracting petrol. And that's why the same energy companies that are involved into dirty energy are also involved into the clean energy. Now, when it comes to technicalities, we can't go into big discussion. For example, wind turbine does not produce stable energy, right? So you need a base, what we call a base plant, which will maintain a stability to the network. So as energy, it is not as productive or as powerful as we think. And of course, when it comes more and more questions, when it comes to the cleanness of a wind turbine. A wind turbine requires usually the same amount of concrete that a 5-story block of flats needs inside the land. Do we have ever studies how this affects water beds? Do we have any studies which tell us where this is going to go 20 years later after this infrastructure will have to be recycled? Is it recycled? Moreover, it's a metal monster. As a metal monster, it means that it needs to be extracted from somewhere. So if we and then need to be recycled or thrown away. If it's thrown away, what about the heavy metals? If we include the various parameters, ecological parameters, the ecological footprint, the CO2 footprint of wind turbine is much more different than one presented. My other problem is that I have done lots of years of political anthropology. So I have learned that you need to mistrust the state authorities. Whatever is promoted by big state authorities quite often has a complicated system of interests behind it. It's a lobby. I told you before about the asphalt. If you study this most simple technologies like asphalt concrete and how it became the prevalent way to pave our roads, to cover our roads, you will realize that asphalt, the only reason that asphalt is our material of choice is because there's a very strong oil lobby that implemented that on us. And so goes about almost every technology. Technology and social studies scholars have provided us lots of social history. I'm definitely not against science. I'm not a anti-vaxxer. I don't suspect that COVID is a conspiracy, but I'm pretty sure that wind turbines and this sudden emphasis of our government, European governments, into green energy has a lot of interest. At the end of the story, Europeans are very few. At the same time, we will get rid of our power plants, coal power plants. China, if you would think at the moment that we will replace our power plants with wind turbines, China will have built the same number of coal-burning factories, energy factories, in order to create various plastic things that we need to consume in this part of the world, because we have been deindustrialized and because we'll not be producing enough energy to keep our factories in this continent. So, it's not helping the environment if you see it in a planetary level. It is mostly a project which is a political project. It's a project which it serves different purposes than it is implying that it's serving. So it is not a green economy that's served from wind turbines. It is not, it is something completely different. It's the replacement of the infrastructures, basically, of the energy production.
Can I just jump in with kind of a few fundamental things, because so I've kind of been talking about, it's not talked about in the commons discourse that much, and I've been talking about the separation of public good and common good, because they have a very different logic. And I think once one separates those and understands the difference in their logic, then you start to pick up on when it's just rhetoric and it's public rhetoric. So in a way, in some of the things that you were talking about with the roads in Albania and the people coming around, the common good rhetoric is one that mobilizes and has power, but actually that is not, in my opinion, common good. That is a public good, and in that sense, and the public good, I mean, okay, I'm looking at it from an economic perspective, but a public good is something that's open to everyone. It's a crowd. Whereas a common good has a defined, I know this is Ostrom's, but I do believe in it. And I do think she was right in that there is a defined community. It does have a defined boundary. And of course, the porosity of that boundary is really the important bit of the design of the commons. So I think that kind of riot group that the rioters were probably more commons to me than the kind of coming together of building the asphalt because they've been socialized to do it. So I think for me it's that, and it goes around the issue of power, which is what you're talking about with the wind turbines, who is holding the power. And so I think with the common good, if one starts to unpack a little bit its different definitions and looking at it from its definition as a distributive, aggregative common good, then it's a very different thing. And I think that's where it probably will be able to be more empowering and goes into the solidarity group kind of logic in that sense. And I think the other thing, and I'm going to then stop there from my perspective, is that I don't think it's so much that we've done enough with the theory of commons, although I think practice is really important, but I think it's about the two of them coming together, the theory and practice, and not in the commons. I think we have to find how other theories can push the boundaries of the current thinking in the commons, because the current thinking in the commons in the literature that is out there does become a bit samey. And they kind of do say the same thing over and over again. So you need other theories now to kind of come in. And I think that logic of power, so what John Holloway talks about when he talks about you cannot take over a kind of social situation or a political situation with a power over, which has power over as its logic, as domination, and then say, well, when I have power, then I start to disseminate it horizontally. You can't do that. You have to already embedded in the power structures that you're forming the commons needs to be from the power to kind of context. So I think some of those things, again, in the political things you were talking about, it worries me when suddenly commons go into mainstream politics. It does worry me because I think that's a power over scenario, and you have to be so careful with that. So anyway, that's that. I'm going to stop there and allow Neil to say something, and then we can maybe discuss.
Thanks, Adrian. Fascinating, really, really lovely, really interesting. I don't know if I have a question yet. One might come as I talk, but last week I was at the Start to Action Festival in Devon. They call it the Playground for the New Economy. And there was a really amazing talk there by Almandeep Dillon, who runs the Ivy House Community Pub in London, one of the UK's first assets of community value. And it was about the Danny Kruger report, which is very much about capitalizing and manipulating all the mutuals, over 40,000 mutuals that happened during COVID, seeing them as a untapped voluntary labor source. And the report, which he went through very beautifully and movingly, describes a really fluffy, lovely ideology that we all agree with, and lots of other lefties agree with as well. But then sneaks in there some really quite devastating, potentially devastating terminology and aspects, which essentially come down to the regulatory text and regulatory language of how things are mechanically achieved. So I mean, the word state deployment was used, and and talking about it in this really kind of fluffy way, it's really nice way. So, oh well, I agree with that. Of course, that sounds wonderful. Is the undercover face of fascism, which is what we've been discussing this entire time. And so it needs a really clear understanding of the commons to be able to fact check and call bullshit when you see it. And exactly, it's the problem of this rhetoric, which is manipulated when there is a clear lack of understanding of what the commons is and a commons ideology. Yeah, so I guess a really live example of that that I've experienced as well is like the Ivy House pub listed as asset community value. One of my venues, Sour Space, was listed. It was only number 3 in the UK, but you know. And what happens there is that although it sounds great, kind of community is taking charge for things that happen locally. Actually, the legal mechanics of how you achieve that are very, very destructive, and it damages landlord-tenant relationships, and it causes delays and long delays, and it distracts us as people working within the commons and communities and mutuals and the cooperative movements from actually getting the job done and getting it effectively done. Meanwhile, you have austerity coming in, privatization happening, social enterprises, which I love, but also is, again, it's another fluffy thing that allows privatization to really kind of take hold on things. It distracts us who actually are knowledgeable and care by saying, well, we could catch on to this rhetoric to try and push the commons and collective agenda. However, in the meantime, the privatization just occupies and pushes forwards. So yeah, I don't actually know. I don't have a question. I just have like chat to say. Yeah, it's a really, really important one that I'm experiencing every day of late. Yeah, I'll stop talking now.
Thank you, Neil. Dimitris, do you want to?
Yeah, let me react. I think that Torange, Neil's comment after your comment encapsulates the best my disagreement with what you said. I agree. You see, the thing is that I think there are too many academics in the commons. It's one more fashionable area of study, and we all asked to try to analyze it, and I don't think we're helping. You know, it's very interesting that you're talking with some veteran commoners, and their reactions like, no more academics, no more journalists, we have work here to do.
But I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner.
I know, Torange, I know. But yeah. I say, by we, I mean we. Yeah. I'm academic, I'm a professor, you know, yeah. And I know, but you see, that's the thing. So we are, but then there is precisely lack of thick and deep understanding of how a common economy, for example, this is distinct from solidarity economy, how social economy is distinct from solidarity economy. What does this mean in terms of practicalities, right? What is the difference between philanthropy and commons? And you know, the rhetoric of commons is it can become very, very dangerous, not only when it's adopted from above, but also, you know, if you will hear, for example, what a Nazi groups talks about solidarity and common interest.
That's the problem of rhetoric, though. Surely that's not, you know, you can take anything and you use it as a manipulated rhetoric, and you can manipulate. You can do that.
I think this is the point, isn't it?
You can,
but we lack practical knowledge. We lack practitioners. That's what we lack.
Yeah.
We lack,
basically. Absolutely.
You see, that's the thing. Unless we have more people embedding in the daily life ideas of common. I mean, like, for example, let me give you the simplest example. Very few academics, I can name them if you want, who work on the commons, and they're very big on commons, and they are not only academics, they're practitioners. They were commoners well before becoming academics. Very, very few of these people, for example, know how to author an article, an academic article, as a common property, right? As something which has common contributions. So, you know, there are lots of practical issues that has to be resolved, which go well beyond what John wrote into Let's Revolt Without Taking the Power, and well beyond what Graeber wrote in Direct Action, well beyond what people have written about it. If we are to write something, we need to write some simple guidelines, some simple practical information and practical ideas, something close to what Marina Citrin did, for example, in a different way, about case studies, in order to understand a bit better how a collective, a post-capital economy of the future will look like.
And I'm going to bring Tim in just a second, but there are also problems with practice that has not had theory as a reflective tool to understand all of that. So that's why I'm saying it's the relationship that is important, because in practice, and I've been part of it many times, there's been a lot of kind of issues that I've had in communities. There's been a lot of issues with conflicts. There's been, you know, there are also a lot of problems in practice. Neil knows this as well. And those of us who are also on the ground practicing so I don't think it's a binary issue, and I don't think it's an either or issue. I think it needs critical reflection. And I think it's part of the practice needs that kind of criticality and reflection in action, actually. And I'm going to bring Tim in because he wanted to say something.
Okay, I've got many thoughts on really interesting issues that I've felt through being involved in groups. The first is that it's very difficult to explain this, but groups that are often really doing stuff, and there are lots of people who are doing stuff, they don't even conceptualize themselves as commons, you know. They are just doing shit, and they have a way of working through it, which often works because there's enough shared desire to achieve the result, I would say. But I think the framework of relations is really not sorted out. So thorny things like, I guess the three things are trust, you know, transparency and co-creation, co-determination. And it's very easy to say these things and to write articles about it, but you try and get transparency even in a group. You get people to admit what they're bringing to the group, subtle power influences. I was in a group where one academic came in without declaring the fact that she created five other people she brought into the group were in projects that she had created the funding for. So this might seem, she's not employing them. But I tell you, to be an artist is not an easy wicket. So if you get into a funded situation as an artist, you're a little bit dependent on the person who created that funding opportunity. So if that isn't declared in a group, that really it becomes impossible. So, and that means there isn't trust, because if you don't feel the transparency is there, it's very difficult to trust. You just get a feeling as though things aren't quite level, but you can't quite work it out. And you can't quite find the language in the group to bring it up, because it seems rude. It seems rude to say, can you declare what, you know? So it's like you need some kind of tax return to start a commons, you know, to sort of declare all your interests but on many levels, you know. I mean, sometimes it's not as direct as that funding one, but it can be about allegiances to certain forms of thinking external to the commons. You know, it could be a religious thing, it could be some kind of a mantra. I mean, there are so many schisms within the commons movement to do with different forms of anarchism, for example, and the kind of the struggle against the very free um, libertarian thing that developed in the US, which Murray Bookchin kind of spoke against quite rightly. But then he then went into, to my mind, a sort of a blind alley by overemphasizing the socialism imperative. And I think what the commons really has to offer, and I don't think we're doing it yet, is how to get this very complicated balance between the individuality of the person working in this group and the common good. It's, I mean, Silke Heltfish, and David Bolyar's books, who I do respect enormously, because I think they are thinkers who are very grounded, and because they work a lot with people who are actually on the front. And she does have some big chapters about that. I mean, even when I first heard Silke talk, it was about this sort of Ubuntu concept, but still, it's difficult. It is really difficult to actually happen in a group. And I'm not sure what the solutions are, but I do know there are plenty of practical problems on the ground that do require, I wouldn't call it even theory, but just the ability to speak honestly with each other about what is the basis of why we're in the commons. It's not really theory we're talking about. It's sort of a new idea of what it is to be an individual in a group, in a commons thing, because we don't really have the history.
But I don't think those things, I mean, for me, those things did not come naturally. I had to read about them, and I had to, and sometimes, when power, you're absolutely right, Tim. I think power relations are very difficult because, especially, I mean, we talked about it in the last session about whether we're sharing power or giving up power, and it's, but when you're in it, you also don't realize, because it's that is quite instinctive. But I think those relationships, if you're not reflectively thinking, okay, now I am actually being a little bit too territorial or powerful or whatever, and I have to, but for me, that would not have come naturally, if I hadn't read about things. So I'm not talking about big philosophies or big theories, but I think some of these things, if I hadn't read about relational ethics of care, and again, I'm not trying to make a case for theory here at all. I just would like this kind of working for us to find ways for it to work. I think that's my ultimate.
The only, I'll just quickly say, and then I know Neil wants to come in, but one helpful book, I think, is Seeds for Change, talking about consensus, because it's very, very practical, that book, and there's no bullshit in it, and it does talk about the difficult ones, where you get conflict in groups, for example.
Yeah. Neil, and then I think we have to start slowly wrapping up.
That was really interesting, Timothy. I mean, so a little bit of context. So I guess was practicing somewhere in the field of the commons for about 10 years before I even discovered that it was a word, until Taranj started the course and then invited me to join. And I think actually, although I do believe that commons do need to be designed, I think actually there's when you are working in close proximities with communities and with people who you have these social relations with, you don't want to be, how do I put it, seen in a negative way. Personally, you want to kind of like promote your own kind of self, and like you say, trust is trust, transparency kind of come hand in hand, and if you have that, and also if you have vulnerability, which is very much about kind of good and agreed communication methods, which very few people have similar training on, then you do kind of form those things, and when you get called out by other people because you're in close proximity, it does kind of keep you in a certain kind of position of honesty. And the more honest you are, the more easy it is to be honest all the time, and then everything's much better. But then I think so in my experience, not necessarily my very specific view of how this should or shouldn't be, I don't think there's one particular way. My practice in it first was very much supportive of being able to create these technical and cultural governance systems, and then being able to learning and understanding what commons is and in a theoretical way allows me to then scrutinize what I've previously done, be more kind of confident in the aspects of it which are kind of aligned with those principles, and make changes. So for me, it's been very, 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 very good to have practice first and then apply theory afterwards and make any necessary changes. And it could come the other way around as well, but I think only from when you actually have practice. Like if it's just theory, then you're screwed and you're not based in reality. But if you have practice, then you do have the means to be able to come to theory afterwards, at least, and correct or improve from where you are. And if we think also that kind of commons does take time, it takes constant evolution as more and more people from within that community start to contribute and co-design and co-create in an ever-changing circumstance of the world, then it has to be kind of practiced, constantly practiced, learned, made mistakes, and potentially fluctuates from being a commons and not a commons anymore if you want to get kind of gritty into the rules. Yeah, again, I'll stop there in case there's any.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dimitris. Are there any closing comments?
Yes, yes, gladly. A very brief comment that I want to make is that quite often there is an interesting phenomenon that one studies. Somebody who studies commons and common projects may often experience. You see that this new wave of commons coming after the crisis of 2010, 2009, is not led by the experts. By experts, I mean veteran activists, or I mean academics, etc., etc. It's quite often led by newly founded political subjects who are shaped and are shaping within the process the practices of commoning. So I think that what we lack is a good understanding of the processes and the phenomena which involve this shaping, this metamorphosis, right? This creation of the. So, in other words, I think that yes, it is. I mean, like if you take it back to social theory of 19th century, you see that the concept of infrastructure is very different from what we consider today. It's not material infrastructures. Labor, for example, is included in infrastructures. Right, so it's very interesting, like the whole idea, irrelevant of whether you agree with Marxist analysis or not, this is not the issue here. The question is, but I think the mapping of infrastructures which create certain superstructures is not wrong. And if you include labor and the work of commoning, the everyday life work of commoning, this is a way to create the infrastructure. The problem at the moment, if you want to see what academic research could contribute, is basically roadmaps, blueprints of how we can create, how basically commoning in 21st century, commoning in 2021 operates. Ostrom wrote what he wrote many decades ago, but it's necessary reading, and I am totally up for it. But if we are to create the infrastructures if we are to create the infrastructure of a collective future, right, of a new future, a post-capitalist, a future of commons, basically, a common future, common future, we need to first of all try to map and decode the actual experience, everyday experience of becoming commons and becoming commoner. So I think that this is a very crucial point that yet we don't have it, and we don't have it because it's a long process. It's not an easy, fast process. They're not easy blueprints. They're not easy answers. They're not easy. It's not easy to map such a thing. This is what I'm trying to do myself. This is what I like. doing at the moment. Because I also feel that it is something that is lacking, right? We don't know yet how the infrastructure for future of a common superstructure will look like. What kind of consciousness we're producing for the future human beings who may have to basically operate this world without governments and without private corporations being on the lead as we grew up in this continent, at least. And I think that's what I would like to be my closing remarks.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us again. So I think we will, as I put my email address on, if you want to be part of, there will be virtual actually, so that we can invite people more globally, like Dimitris. Going forward, we will have them digitally. So if you would like to get notifications of what there is and these debates going on, then please do sign up. Otherwise, have a wonderful summer, enjoy the weather, and speak to you all, hope to see you all in other settings.
Thank you for organizing that, Torang, and thank you very much for the invitation. That looked like a lovely series of talks. Not because I was one of the speakers, I refer to the previous speakers.
Yes. No, it was great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, everyone. Really appreciate that.